4,500 years ago, on a desert plain west of the Nile, three structures were erected that defied the passage of time, wars, empires, and the very erosion of the planet. The pyramids of Giza are not merely funerary monuments. They are unsolved problems. Every answer that science provides opens three new questions. To understand what the pyramids meant, it is necessary to know what existed before them. Pre-dynastic Egypt between 6000 and 3100 BC was a collection of agricultural villages scattered along the Nile. The river's annual floods deposited fertile silt that allowed abundant harvests in the middle of the desert. That predictability of the natural cycle was the economic foundation that made everything that came afterward possible. Around 3100 BC, Pharaoh Nama, or Menes according to some sources, unified Upper and Lower Egypt under a single crown. With that unification, the Egyptian state was born, a centralized bureaucratic structure capable of mobilizing human and material resources on a scale unprecedented in history. Without that administrative machinery, no pyramid would have been possible. The first royal tombs were simple rectangular pits lined with wood or mud brick. They soon evolved into mastabas, adobe structures with a rectangular plan, flat roof, and sloping walls. The pharaohs of the first two dynasties were buried in mastabas at Abydos and Saqqara. The transition toward pyramids was not a sudden leap, but a progression that took several generations. Geography played a determining role in all of this. The Nile was not only a source of food, it was the country's main logistical artery. Any heavy object, from a 2-ton limestone block to a 100-ton granite obelisk, could be transported by water with a fraction of the effort that land transport would have required. The quarries of Tura on the other side of the river and those of Aswan, 800 kilometers to the south, were accessible precisely because the Nile connected them with the construction sites. Around 2650 BC, during the reign of Pharaoh Djoser of the Third Dynasty, an architect named Imhotep conceived something that did not exist in the world: a monumental tomb built of limestone with 6 superimposed steps rising to 62 meters in height. That structure, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara, was the first large-scale building constructed entirely of stone in human history. Imhotep was not only an architect. Egyptian texts described him as a physician, astronomer, scribe, and high priest. 2,000 years after his death, he was deified, an extraordinary honor reserved for very few people who were not of royal blood. The Greeks identified him with their god of medicine, Asclepius. That a builder attained such divine status speaks to how exceptional his legacy was. The Step Pyramid of Saqqara did not stand alone. It formed part of a 15-hectare funerary complex surrounded by a 10-meter-high limestone wall with 14 false doors and a single real entrance. Courtyards, chapels, temples, and underground galleries composed an architectural universe designed for eternity. Beneath the pyramid, a network of tunnels more than 5.7 kilometers long contained the remains of the pharaoh and thousands of ritual objects. What made Djoser's pyramid possible was not only Imhotep's vision, but also the consolidation of the resource extraction system that the Egyptian state had developed during the first two dynasties. The Tura limestone quarries, worker registration systems, food supply routes, and hierarchies of technical supervision existed in embryonic form before Djoser. Imhotep took them to a scale never before attempted. Between Djoser's pyramid and the Great Pyramid of Giza, there is only 1 century, but that century was a laboratory of uninterrupted architectural experimentation. Pharaoh Sneferu, father of Khufu and founder of the 4th dynasty, built not 1 but 3 pyramids, and each represents a different chapter in the learning process. The first was the Pyramid of Meidum. It began as a 7-step pyramid and was later transformed into a smooth-sided pyramid by filling in the steps with limestone casing. The result, however, was unstable. The outer layers collapsed at some point in antiquity, leaving a central tower surrounded by rubble. That partial failure was a technical lesson of incalculable value. Sneferu's second pyramid is the bent or rhomboidal pyramid at Dashur. It began with an angle of inclination of 54 degrees, but halfway through construction, the engineers reduced the angle to 43 degrees, probably because they detected structural stresses that threatened stability. The change in angle gives it that unmistakably bent shape that no other monument in the world shares. It is the only known example of a design adjustment documented in the visible geometry of a pyramid itself. Sneferu's third pyramid was the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur. With a constant angle of 43 degrees and a height of 104 meters, it is the first completely successful smooth-sided pyramid in history. Its modern name comes from the pinkish hue that the limestone takes on at certain hours of the day. Sneferu invested in his 3 pyramids an amount of stone greater than that used by any other individual pharaoh, including his own son Khufu. That process of trial and error during Sneferu's reign is one of the strongest arguments against theories that postulate an external or lost technology to explain the pyramids. An agent in possession of advanced technology would not have needed decades of experimentation, nor left failed or half-finished pyramids as evidence of its learning. What the structures of the 4th dynasty show, with complete clarity, is the archaeological record of a learning curve. The Great Pyramid of Khufu, built around 2560 BC, was the tallest building in the world for 3,800 years. Its original 146.5 meters, today reduced to 138.5 meters, because of the loss of the polished limestone casing, were not surpassed until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in the 14th century. But height is only one of its extraordinary features. The pyramid is composed of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks with an average weight of 2.5 tons each. Some blocks in the inner chambers reach 80 tons. The estimated total weight of the structure is 5.9 million tons. The base occupies 5.3 hectares, and each side measures 230 meters with a maximum deviation of barely 7.8 centimeters between them, a margin of error of less than 0.1%. The pyramid's orientation toward the cardinal points is equally precise. The sides are aligned with north, south, east, and west with a deviation of only 3 minutes and 6 seconds of arc. That precision exceeds that of many modern measuring instruments and raises a question that archaeologists still debate. What astronomical reference method did the Egyptians use to achieve it? A recent hypothesis, published in the Journal of Egyptian Archaeology, proposes that the builders used circumpolar stars to determine true north. By observing the midpoint of the arc traced by a polar star in the night sky, surveyors could establish a north-south line with surprising precision using only a plumb line and a staff. Advanced technology was not needed, but systematic observation and patience. Another of the facts that causes perplexity is the implied speed of construction. If the Great Pyramid was built in 20 years, the workers had to place 1 block every 2 minutes on average during continuous 10-hour workdays, throughout the 12 months of the year, without any interruption. Some researchers argue that construction was concentrated during the periods of Nile flooding, when farmers could not work the land and were available as labor. In that case, the effective working period is reduced and the speed of block placement rises even further. Contrary to what might be assumed, the interior of the Great Pyramid is not solid. It contains a system of passages, chambers, and galleries that archaeologists have explored for centuries without exhausting its secrets. The internal architecture suggests changes of plan during construction, revealing a dynamic building process and not a monolithic design executed without variations. The access system begins with the original entrance on the north face, 17 meters above the base. A 26-degree descending passage leads toward an underground chamber excavated in the living rock beneath the pyramid. That chamber was abandoned unfinished, suggesting that the original plan was modified during construction. An ascending passage of the same angle rises from the entrance to the Grand Gallery, a monumental corridor 47 meters long, 8.7 meters high, and with walls of 7 courses of stone that progressively overlap in corbel fashion to form an approximate vault. The Grand Gallery leads to the King's Chamber, the best-known space in the interior, where the empty red granite sarcophagus from Aswan rests. The King's Chamber has precise dimensions, 10.47 meters long, 5.23 meters wide, and 5.81 meters high. The ceiling is formed by 9 enormous granite slabs. Above them are 5 relieving chambers, the uppermost with a gabled roof, whose function is to distribute the weight of the millions of tons of rock rising above. Without those chambers, the ceiling would have collapsed millennia ago. The Queen's Chamber, smaller and accessible through a horizontal passage from the Grand Gallery, has 2 niches in the walls and 2 narrow shafts that rise diagonally toward the exterior. Identical shafts also emerge from the king's chamber. For decades, they were believed to be simple ventilation channels, but in 1993, a robot sent by German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink discovered that one of the shafts of the queen's chamber ended at a small stone door with copper handles. Behind that door, as a second robot revealed in 2002, there was another door. What exists beyond remains unknown. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids Project, an international collaboration of universities from Egypt, France, Japan, and Canada, published in the journal Nature a finding that shook world archaeology. Using muography, a technique based on the detection of muons, subatomic particles generated by cosmic rays when they collide with the atmosphere, researchers identified a large cavity inside the Great Pyramid. That cavity, initially named the Great Void, is located above the Grand Gallery and is at least 30 meters long. Its orientation and dimensions do not correspond to any known structure inside the pyramid. The researchers were deliberately cautious in their conclusions. They did not claim that it was a secret chamber, but that there was an empty space whose nature and function are unknown. This discovery demonstrated that moography can be an archaeological tool of extraordinary usefulness. The technique does not require drilling or excavation. Moons penetrate the rock and are detected by sensors placed inside or outside the structure. By measuring the density of particles passing through different sections, a volumetric map of what lies inside can be generated. In 2023, the Scan Pyramids team announced that it was continuing the analysis with new higher resolution detectors. Another relevant discovery came in 2023 from a completely different front. Archaeologists working in the Giza region found remains of a Nile channel that in antiquity ran only a few hundred meters from the pyramids. That channel, today completely buried beneath sediments, would have allowed the enormous limestone blocks to be transported by water from the Tura quarries to the very foot of the pyramids. It would be the most plausible logistical answer to a question that has been asked for centuries. In that same year, analyses of pollen and sediments taken from stratigraphic drillings on the Giza plateau revealed that 4,500 years ago the climate of the region was significantly wetter than it is today. The Sahara was then passing through the final phase of the so-called African humid period, which lasted approximately between 11,000 and 5,000 BC. That greater humidity implied more abundant vegetation, seasonal watercourses, and logistical conditions very different from those of the present-day desert. The Giza Plateau in the time of Khufu was a greener and more navigable environment than 21st century tourists can imagine. For centuries, the idea circulated that the pyramids were built by slaves. That image, popularized by the Bible and later by cinema, was definitively disproved by modern archaeology. The decisive blow came in 1990, when archaeologist Zahi Hawass and his team accidentally discovered the cemetery of the pyramid builders, barely 300 meters from the Great Sphinx. The tombs found in that cemetery revealed that the builders were free workers, not slaves. The skeletons showed signs of intense physical labor, with old bone fractures that had healed well, indicating that they received medical care. Some bones revealed amputations performed with surgical precision that would have allowed the individual to survive. The more elaborate tombs belonged to supervisors and specialized craftsmen and contained funerary offerings, indicating that they enjoyed recognized social status. Ostraka, fragments of pottery and limestone used as paper in ancient Egypt, provided information about the organization of labor. The builders were divided into groups with their own names, something like military divisions, the Sleeping Gang, or the Friends of Khufu. They worked in rotating shifts and received as payment rations of bread, beer, onions, meat, and fish. Between 20,000 and 30,000 workers are estimated at the moments of greatest activity, although the permanent number at the site was considerably smaller. The discovery in 2013 of the diaries of the official Mira at the port site of Wadi al-Jaf beside the Red Sea provided the most direct written testimony that exists about the construction of the Great Pyramid. Mira was responsible for a team of 40 men who transported blocks of white limestone from the Tura quarries to Giza. His records, 4,500 years old, mention journeys through canals, quantities of stone moved, and the name of the Vizier Ankaf as general supervisor of the work. It is the only contemporary document that directly mentions the construction of Khufu's pyramid. Mera's diaries also reveal the complexity of the logistical apparatus. Mera and his team traveled between the quarries and the construction site in wooden boats, using the system of canals that bordered the Nile. The records are detailed and methodical, with daily entries recording the number of blocks transported, weather conditions, stops made, and supplies received. That degree of bureaucratic detail is only possible in a society with established writing, specialized officials, and a well-defined chain of command. The transport and placement of millions of stone blocks within a period that archaeologists estimate at between 20 and 30 years remains one of the greatest engineering problems in history. There is no definitive answer regarding the exact method of raising the blocks, and it is likely that different systems were used in different phases of construction. For the blocks of the lower level, horizontal transport was the main challenge. Egyptian bas-reliefs show wooden sledges pulled by groups of men over surfaces lubricated with water or oil. An experiment reproduced in 2014 by researchers at the University of Amsterdam demonstrated that wetting the sand in front of the sledge reduced the coefficient of friction by half, making it possible for a group of men to drag blocks weighing several hundred kilograms with relative efficiency. For raising the blocks as the pyramid grew in height, the hypotheses are divided into three major groups. The first proposes a continuous exterior ramp that would surround the pyramid in a spiral, but that ramp by itself would have required an amount of material comparable to the pyramid itself, making it implausible. The second proposes a straight frontal ramp that would have grown in length and angle as construction advanced. The third, proposed by French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin, suggests that an interior spiral ramp existed within the mass of the pyramid itself, visible today in density tomography images. What is well documented is the quality of the stonework. The granite blocks of the king's chamber were quarried in Aswan, more than 800 kilometers away. The contact surfaces between adjacent blocks are so smooth that they barely allow a sheet of paper to be inserted between them. The Egyptians used copper chisels, wooden mallets, and wet wooden wedges to split the rock, and plumb lines and taut cords to verify the flatness of the surfaces. An aspect frequently underestimated is the role of wood in construction. Egypt did not have forests of its own, so wood was an imported and costly resource brought mainly from Lebanon. Mera's diaries mention expeditions organized expressly to obtain cedar wood intended for transport equipment. Without that, wood, sledges, rollers, levers, and scaffolding would not have existed. The organization of labor was as important as engineering itself. The bas-reliefs of mastabas of high officials of the period show scenes of construction supervision, with foremen counting blocks, inspectors measuring angles with squares, and administrators recording quantities on papyrus rolls. The pyramid was not only a feat of brute force, but also a feat of information management. The other two Great Pyramids of the Giza complex were built by Khufu's successors. The Pyramid of Khafre, Khufu's son, was erected around 2530 BC and is 136 meters high, barely 10 meters less than his father's. Unlike the Great Pyramid, Khafre still preserves part of its original polished limestone casing at the summit, making it possible to imagine what all these structures looked like when they shone beneath the desert sun. Khafre's pyramid is built on a rocky platform slightly higher than Khufu's, which makes it appear visually taller from certain angles, although it is actually lower. In front of it rises the Great Sphinx, carved directly into an outcrop of natural limestone. Although conventional dating places it in the reign of Khafre, the Sphinx is itself an object of permanent archaeological debate. The third pyramid of the complex, that of Menkaure, is significantly smaller, 65 meters of original height and 1/3 of the volume of the Great Pyramid. It was built around 2510 BC and preserves on its lower third a partial casing of red granite from Aswan, which was the original covering planned for the entire structure. Menkaure's death interrupted the project, and his successor completed the lower casing with lower quality white limestone. The three pyramids are not identical in arrangement. Seen from the air, their alignment is neither parallel nor in a perfect straight line. Menkaure's is slightly displaced toward the east. That detail generated in 1994 a widely circulated hypothesis formulated by journalist Robert Bauval. The three pyramids would correspond exactly to the three stars of Orion's belt as they appeared in the sky around 10,500 BC. The proposal, called the Orion correlation theory, was received with popular enthusiasm, but with skepticism by the archaeological community, which pointed out that astronomical correlations of that kind are relatively easy to find if the parameters are adjusted sufficiently. In front of the pyramid complex, facing east, stands the Great Sphinx, a being with the body of a lion and a human head carved from a monolithic block of limestone 73 meters long, 20 meters high, and 14 meters wide. It is the largest monolithic sculpture in the world and one of the most recognizable objects of humanity's cultural heritage. It is also, in many respects, the deepest enigma of the Giza complex. The conventional attribution links the Sphinx to the reign of Khafre, based on its proximity to that pharaoh's pyramid and on the dream stele of Thutmose IV, a text carved in stone between the Sphinx's paws that mentions the god Horemheb, the name by which the Egyptians referred to the Sphinx, but does not explicitly name Khafre as its builder. In 1991, geologist John Anthony West and geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University presented a hypothesis that caused considerable impact outside academia and a markedly critical response within it. Schoch argued that the erosion patterns observed on the body of the Sphinx and on the walls of the enclosure surrounding it do not correspond to wind erosion by wind and sand, but to water erosion caused by intense rainfall. Given that North Africa has had a dry climate since at least 5000 BC, Schoch argued that the Sphinx must have been carved before that date, possibly between 7000 and 5000 BC, pushing its origin thousands of years earlier than accepted. Most Egyptologists rejected that hypothesis, pointing out that the erosion could be explained by other factors, including nighttime moisture condensation, the salt present in the limestone, or local Nile flooding. The dispute between geologists and archaeologists over the dating of the Sphinx has not concluded. What is indisputable is that the Sphinx's nose was not destroyed by Napoleon, as a persistent legend claims. Engravings from the 15th century, predating any European presence in Egypt, already show it without a nose. The text of a 14th century Arab historian, Muhammad al-Makrizi, attributes the destruction of the nose to a religious sheikh who considered the statue an object of idolatrous worship. Ground-penetrating radar explorations carried out in the 1990s and 2000s detected anomalies beneath the ground around the Sphinx and in its immediate surroundings, some of which could correspond to chambers or passages. The Egyptian government has not authorized drilling in that area, so those anomalies remain unverified. The Sphinx continues to watch the eastern horizon with the same stony impassiveness with which it has resisted time and questions. The connections between the Giza complex and astronomy go beyond the Orion correlation theory. The pyramids show alignments with celestial phenomena that cannot be attributed to chance, but whose exact intention cannot be established with certainty either. The shafts of the Great Pyramid pointed, at the time of its construction, towards specific stars in the night sky. The northern shaft of the King's Chamber was oriented toward the star Thuban, the pole star of the time, taking into account that the Earth's axial precession shifts the pole star over the millennia. The southern shaft of the King's Chamber pointed toward Orion. The northern shaft of the Queen's Chamber was directed toward the star Kochab in Ursa Minor, and the southern shaft toward Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, which the Egyptians associated with the goddess Isis, and whose heliacal rising coincided with the beginning of the Nile floods. The Sphinx temple complex is oriented so that at the spring equinox, the sun rises exactly in front of the Sphinx's face, between the pyramids of Khufu and Khafre. That alignment could not have been accidental. The equinoxes were dates of great significance in the Egyptian agricultural and religious calendar, associated with the cycle of death and resurrection of the god Ra. The relationship between the Egyptians and the sky was practical and religious simultaneously. There was no separation in their world between astronomy and theology. Celestial phenomena were the writing of the gods, and building monuments aligned with them was a way of inscribing pharaonic power into the cosmic order. That explains the obsession with precision in orientations, which was not a technical display, but a ritual act. The astronomer priests of ancient Egypt, called those who know the secrets of the sky, were high-ranking officials who systematically observed the movement of the stars from the rooftops of temples. Their observations were recorded in tables that made it possible to predict astronomical phenomena months in advance. The Egyptian calendar of 365 days was established on the basis of that systematic observation of the night sky, and was one of the most precise in the ancient world. One of the characteristics that has most intrigued scholars is the relative scarcity of inscriptions inside the Great Pyramids. The pyramids of the 4th dynasty, including those of Giza, almost completely lack texts in their inner chambers. This absence contrasts markedly with the pyramids of later dynasties. The pyramid texts first appear in the pyramid of Pharaoh Unas of the 5th dynasty around 2375 BC, almost 200 years after Khufu. They are the oldest known corpus of funerary religious literature, a collection of spells, prayers, magical formulas, and hymns carved into the walls of chambers and passages with the purpose of guiding and protecting the pharaoh on his journey to the afterlife. The texts mention stars, gods, celestial boats, and transformations of the soul. The absence of those texts in the Great Pyramid does not mean that there were no beliefs associated with its construction. Some researchers have suggested that in Khufu's time, funerary rituals may have been transmitted orally or through papyri that have not survived. Others propose that the smooth surfaces of the stone were themselves part of the architectural conception, and that inscriptions would have interfered with that formal purity. The only contemporary text that exists inside the Great Pyramid is notably humble. In 1837, explorer Howard Weiss discovered in one of the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber the name of one of the work crews, the Gang of the Horizon of Khufu. That 4,500-year-old graffiti, written with red pigment, is the oldest known inscription inside the pyramid and the only one that directly names the pharaoh whose tomb was being built. For decades, some skeptics questioned the authenticity of that inscription and accused Weiss of having forged it. In 2014, an inspection with ultraviolet light and pigment analyses confirmed that the inscription is authentic and dates from the Old Kingdom. Giza monopolizes attention, but not the entirety of the Egyptian pyramid phenomenon. Egypt has more than 130 identified pyramids, distributed along the desert strip bordering the Nile between Giza and Meroe in northern Sudan. Many are in a ruined state, others still not fully excavated. Saqqara is the most extensive and varied necropolis. In addition to the Step Pyramid of Djoser, it houses pyramids of pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties, some of them built more quickly and less carefully than those of Giza, and therefore today reduced to mounds of rubble. Important archaeological discoveries have been made at Saqqara in recent years, including the 2022 discovery of more than 250 painted wooden sarcophagi and bronze statues in an exceptional state of preservation. The pyramids of Abusir between Giza and Saqqara belong to pharaohs of the 5th dynasty and are relatively well preserved. It is at Abusir where the archives of the funerary temple of Pharaoh Neferirkare were excavated, the oldest known administrative documents from Egypt with lists of guard shifts, inventories of cult objects, and records of food rations. In southern Egypt, at the site of Meroe in present-day Sudan, more than 200 Nubian pyramids of the Kushite civilization survive, narrower and with steeper angles than the Egyptian ones, built between 700 BC and 300 AD. These pyramids, although much less known than those of Giza, demonstrate that the pyramidal form exerted a cultural influence that extended for 3 millennia and over more than 1,000 kilometers. The pyramids of Dashur, beyond those of Sneferu, include the Black Pyramid of Amenemhat III of the 12th dynasty, built with a mud brick core that partially collapsed in antiquity and gave it its current appearance of an irregular dark mass. The contrast between the durability of the solid limestone pyramids of Giza and the deterioration of the brick pyramids of later periods reveals how much the builders of the 4th dynasty knew about choosing materials for eternity. No monument in history has attracted such a vast number of unconventional explanations. The pyramids have been attributed to extraterrestrial technology, lost high-technology civilizations, magical powers, unknown energy sources, and dozens of other hypotheses that circulate in alternative popular books, documentaries, and digital platforms. The extraterrestrial intervention hypothesis holds that the Egyptians of the dynastic period would not have been capable of building the pyramids without technological assistance of non-human origin. That hypothesis rests on the implicit premise that ancient societies could not develop large-scale organizational and technical capacities. which contradicts the available archaeological evidence. Mira's diaries, the builders' cemeteries, the copper tools found in situ, the remains of workers' camps, and the administrative documents of Abusa together form a coherent picture of how the pyramids were built by human means. The hypothesis of an earlier advanced civilization, popularized by journalist Graham Hancock in his 1995 book Keepers of Genesis, proposes that the pyramids and the Sphinx were built or designed by a technologically sophisticated culture that existed before the end of the last ice age, around 10,500 BC. That proposal lacks archaeological evidence to support it. There are no artifacts, structures, writing, or biological remains of that supposed civilization. Schock's geological dating of the Sphinx, which Hancock uses as one of his main arguments, remains debated among specialists and has not reached consensus. Some more technical hypotheses propose that the stone blocks were not carved but manufactured in situ through an agglomeration process, mixing limestone powder with water and minerals to create a kind of ancient concrete. Geologist Joseph Davidovits has defended that idea since the 1980s. Analyses carried out through electron microscopy on some pyramid blocks have found air bubbles and crystallization structures that some researchers interpret as indicators of a molding process rather than carving. Other specialists explain those same characteristics by the natural variability of limestone or by weathering processes. What all these alternative hypotheses share is the underestimation of the technical and intellectual capacities of past civilizations. Experimental archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that with the tools and materials available in Old Kingdom Egypt, tasks that seem impossible become difficult but achievable. The gap between difficult to imagine and impossible to do is the space where mythical explanations thrive. The conventional interpretation of the pyramids as pharaonic tombs is the one with the greatest documentary and archaeological support. However, the fact that none of the Great Pyramids of Giza contained a royal mummy at the time of their modern exploration has fueled legitimate questions about whether the funerary function was the only one or the principal one. The absence of mummies can be explained by looting. The pyramids were violated in antiquity. The pyramid texts of later periods mention pillaging as a serious problem, and evidence of forced access to chambers and passages has been documented in multiple structures. The granite sarcophagus in the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid was already open when the Arabs first entered the chamber in the 9th century. But the pyramids were also much more than a burial place. Each pyramid was the center of a funerary complex that included a valley temple. At the edge of the desert and near the water, a processional causeway that ascended toward the pyramid, and a mortuary temple attached to the east face of the pyramid. That complex formed the setting for the pharaoh's funerary cult, which was to be perpetuated eternally through ritual offerings performed by specialized priests. The pyramid itself was the device of transformation, the place where the pharaohs Ka and Ba made their transition toward the divine state. The astronomical shafts may have served to allow the pharaoh's soul to ascend toward the circumpolar stars, which the Egyptians considered immortal because they never disappeared below the horizon. The pyramid was, in that sense, as much a ritual machine as a building. The very shape of the pyramid has a religious explanation in Egyptian cosmology. The benben, a sacred conical or pyramidal stone kept in the temple of Ra at Heliopolis, was the symbol of the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at the moment of creation. The pyramid reproduced that symbol on a monumental scale, turning the pharaoh's tomb into a petrified image of the origin of the universe. In that context, each pyramid was simultaneously a tomb, a temple, and a cosmological representation. The construction of the pyramids was not only an architectural project, it was an economic engine that transformed Egyptian society. The logistics of feeding, housing, and coordinating tens of thousands of workers for decades required the development of unprecedented systems of administration, accounting, storage, and distribution. Excavations of the Giza workers' settlement have revealed bakeries, breweries, slaughterhouses, and hospitals capable of serving a labor population of several thousand people. Analyses of animal bones found in that settlement show a diet that included significant quantities of meat, suggesting that the workers received better food than the general population. That reinforces the idea that working on the pyramid was for many Egyptians a way of gaining access to resources they otherwise would not have had. The construction of the pyramids also consolidated the pharaoh's power in a way that no other project could have achieved. A monument visible from dozens of kilometers away, which took an entire lifetime to build, was the most tangible demonstration of the sovereign's absolute power over the resources of the state. Each block placed was an argument of authority. Paradoxically, that same power may have contained the seeds of its decline. Egyptologists have proposed that the economic effort of building pyramids continuously over generations was one of the causes of the weakening of the central state at the end of the Old Kingdom. The 6th dynasty built increasingly smaller and more poorly made pyramids, and shortly after its end, the Egyptian state fragmented during the period known as the First Intermediate Period, a century and a half of political decentralization and economic crisis. The data on the size and quality of the pyramids over time tell in themselves a story with a dramatic arc. The pyramids of the 4th dynasty reach their peak with those of Giza, massive, built with large blocks, faced with polished Tura limestone. Those of the 5th dynasty are smaller and use more irregular blocks. Those of the 6th dynasty are structurally inferior, with cores of compacted rubble instead of solid blocks. The downward curve is an indirect measure of the decline in the resources available to the central state. The later history of the pyramids is also a story of uses and transformations. During the New Kingdom, the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty carried out restoration work on the Sphinx and the Valley Temple. Pharaoh Thutmose IV ordered the sand covering the body of the Sphinx to be excavated and placed between its paws the dream stele, which recounts how the god appeared to him in a dream and promised him the throne of Egypt if he freed it from the sand. The polished limestone casing that originally covered the pyramids was progressively plundered during the Middle Ages to build mosques, palaces, and buildings in Cairo. The Mosque of Ibn Tulun and much of the city's medieval walls are built partly with stone from the Giza casing. By the 14th century, most of the casing had disappeared. Western scientific interest in the pyramids began with the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt in 1798, which included a group of more than 150 savants, scientists, artists, and writers. Their observations, published in the monumental Description de l'Égypte between 1809 and 1828, represented the first systematic inventory of the pharaonic heritage and the starting point of modern Egyptology as a discipline. Throughout the 19th century, the Giza Plateau was the scene of excavations that combined emerging scientific rigor with looting and the trafficking of antiquities. The Italian explorer Giovanni Belzoni was the first to gain access to the interior of Khafre's pyramid in 1818 using gunpowder explosives to open a path. British Colonel Howard Vyse used iron bars in 1837 to open the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. Those interventions caused irreversible damage, but also produced the first detailed records of the interiors of the structures. Today, the pyramids receive millions of visitors a year and are the subject of a permanent debate between the need for conservation and the pressures of tourism. The moisture generated by visitors breathing in enclosed spaces causes deterioration of the walls. The movement of people causes vibrations. The Egyptian government has implemented rotating access systems and artificial ventilation and periodically restricts entry to certain areas to allow the stone to recover. Surprisingly little is known about Khufu, the pharaoh who ordered the construction of the largest building of antiquity. There is no contemporary text describing his character, his government, or his vision. Later sources are scarce and contradictory. Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, some 2,000 years after Khufu, describes the pharaoh as a cruel tyrant who closed the temples and forced his own people to work as slaves. That description, disproved by modern archaeology, probably reflects the oral tradition of later Egyptian priests more than historical reality. The only known portrait of Khufu is a small ivory statuette barely 7.5 centimeters high, found in 1903 in the ruins of the temple at Abydos. That figurine, displayed today in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, is the only known three-dimensional representation of the man who ordered the construction of the most colossal monument in history. The disproportion between the scale of his work and the scale of what survives of him is itself a disturbing fact. Khufu reigned for a period that Egyptologists estimate at between 23 and 63 years, with the debate centered on the interpretation of the royal annals. If his reign was long, the pyramid was built at a relatively calm pace. If it was short, The pace of work must have been extraordinarily intense. Mira's diaries mention the vizier Enkhkaf, Khufu's nephew, as supervisor of the work, suggesting that construction was administered by a select group of high-ranking officials from the royal family. Despite centuries of exploration, the pyramids still preserve documented secrets. The Great Void, detected by scan pyramids in 2017, remains physically unexplored. The chambers behind the doors of the Queen's chamber shafts remain inaccessible. The anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar beneath the Sphinx have not been verified by excavations, and it is possible that buried structures exist beneath the sand of the Giza plateau that have not yet been detected. Technology is expanding the possibilities of exploration in ways that would have seemed impossible barely 2 decades ago. Tomography can map rock densities without drilling. Ground-penetrating radar can detect cavities beneath the surface. Photogrammetry makes it possible to create 3-dimensional models with sub-millimeter precision of every block and every joint. Isotopic analysis of mortars can establish construction dates with greater precision. Artificial intelligence applied to the analysis of satellite images is revealing traces of ancient structures buried beneath the sand that the human eye would not detect. In 2024, the Grand Egyptian Museum of Giza opened its doors definitively after years of construction, housing the most complete collection of Egyptian antiquities in the world, including the entire treasure of Tutankhamun and full-scale replicas of some pharaonic structures. The proximity of that museum to the pyramids is generating new excavations in peripheral areas of the plateau that have gone for decades without systematic investigation. The fundamental questions about the pyramids have not changed in centuries. What lies in the unexplored cavities? How exactly the heaviest blocks were raised? Why the Great Pyramid was built with such almost irrational precision, and what they meant to their builders beyond what the official texts say? Every partial answer offered by science reveals the complexity of what remains to be understood. And in every new scanning campaign, in every fragment of papyrus unearthed, in every isotope analysis, the pyramids continue to yield with extreme parsimony fragments of a story they began to tell 4,500 years ago.